The invoice arrived stapled to a notice explaining that since I had failed to clear my walkway within the required 24-hour window, following a recent storm, the HOA had dispatched its own contracted crew to perform the work, and that I now owed $340 to cover the emergency service fee, an invoice that confused me considerably since I had cleared my own walkway myself, by hand, the very same morning the storm ended. Nearly 6 hours before the deadline, the notice claimed I had missed. My name is Odalise Fararich-Turberg. I live in Thornfield Ridge, a community of about 210 homes, and I want to establish clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows, that I take snow removal seriously, partly out of simple neighborly courtesy, and partly because my elderly mother, who lives with me, uses a walker and depends on that path being clear the moment any snow falls. I am, if anything, unusually prompt about clearing snow, typically finishing well within an hour or two of a storm ending, rather than anywhere close to the 24-hour window our community's guidelines actually allow. I want to walk you through the specific morning in question, because the timeline matters enormously for what happened next. The storm ended around 6 in the morning, and I was out clearing my walkway by 7, finished entirely by 1/2 past, exactly as I had done for every storm that entire winter. I want to tell you about my reaction upon receiving that invoice 4 days later. Genuine confusion followed quickly by a distinct, uneasy feeling that something about this didn't add up, since I distinctly remembered finishing that work myself, alone, with nobody else present to witness or document it beyond my own memory. The woman responsible for the invoice was Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe, president of our HOA board for a little over a year at that point. I want to walk you through the conversation I had with her directly after receiving the invoice, because her response revealed a confidence in the claimed violation that struck me as considerably more certain than the situation, based entirely on my own clear memory of that morning, actually warranted. She stated that the HOA's contracted snow removal service had documented my walkway as uncleared during their standard morning route check, performed, according to her account, around 10 that same morning, well after I had already finished my own work. I want to sit with that specific detail, because it created a direct factual contradiction I couldn't simply dismiss as a misunderstanding. If I had genuinely finished clearing my walkway by 7:30, as I clearly remembered doing, there was no way a contracted crew checking at 10 that same morning could have found it uncleared, unless something else had happened to that walkway in the intervening 2.5 hours, or unless the contracted crew's documentation simply wasn't accurate. I want to introduce you to my neighbor across the street, a man named Bartholomew Nkemelu, who happened to have installed a doorbell camera system the previous fall, positioned in a way that captured a partial view of my own front walkway across the street, a detail I hadn't thought to consider relevant until I mentioned the confusing invoice to him over our shared mailbox cluster a few days later. "Odalise," he said, once I described the situation, "let me check my camera's storage. I don't clear that footage very often, and if the storm was as recent as you're describing, there's a decent chance I still have the recording from that exact morning." I want to tell you about the moment Bartholomew pulled up that footage, because it resolved the entire mystery with a clarity neither of us fully expected. The recording showed, with a clear, unambiguous timestamp, my own figure out on the walkway at 7:14 that morning, actively clearing snow, finishing the visible portion of the work by roughly 7:35, exactly matching my own memory of the timeline. But the footage showed something else too, something that took a moment to fully register once we kept watching further into the morning. At approximately 9:50, a truck belonging to the HOA's contracted snow removal service pulled up in front of my house, and rather than simply confirming the walkway was already clear and moving on, the crew appeared to spend several minutes actively working on my walkway themselves, before departing around 10, precisely the time Priscilla had cited as when their documentation of an uncleared walkway had supposedly occurred. I want to sit with what this actually suggested, because Bartholomew and I both arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion at roughly the same moment. The contracted crew had not found my walkway uncleared at all. They had performed unnecessary additional work on an already clear walkway, work that then became the basis for the $340 invoice, meaning either the crew itself had generated unnecessary billable work, or someone within the reporting chain had misrepresented what had actually occurred that morning. I want to walk you through the decision I made at that point, because I understood almost immediately that I now possessed something considerably more valuable than a simple dispute over my own memory of events. I had time-stamped, independent video evidence directly contradicting the entire factual basis of the invoice, and I decided, before confronting Priscilla with it directly, to first understand whether this was an isolated billing error or part of something more systematic, a decision that led me to quietly ask a handful of other neighbors, over the following week, whether any of them had received similar unexpected snow removal invoices that winter. What I found, once I'd spoken with about 8 households, revealed a pattern considerably larger than my own individual dispute, and it's the reason this story ends not with a simple $340 refund, but with a genuinely serious billing fraud investigation into exactly how many other Thornfield Ridge families had been charged for snow removal work that had never actually been necessary in the first place. I want to walk you through what I found asking around, because the scope surprised me considerably more than I expected going in. Of the 8 households I spoke with, 5 had received a similar unexpected snow removal invoice at some point that winter, always following the exact same pattern, a claim that their walkway had been found uncleared during a route check, followed by a contracted crew fee, always in the range of $300 to $360, and every single one of those 5 families, much like me initially, had simply paid the invoice rather than dispute it. Assuming the contracted crew's documentation must have been accurate, I want to introduce you to one of those 5 families, a couple named Farrokh and Rosalind Okonkwo Ferreira, who mentioned something during our conversation that added a critical piece to the emerging picture. They told me that their own invoice had arrived following a storm when Farrokh had, in fact, been genuinely delayed in clearing their walkway, having been traveling for work, meaning they'd assumed at the time that the charge was entirely legitimate. But when I described what Bartholomew's footage had shown regarding my own supposedly uncleared walkway, Rosalind mentioned, almost as an aside, that their invoice amount had actually seemed unusually high compared to what a neighbor on a different street, outside our specific HOA, had mentioned paying an independent snow removal company for comparable work performed privately, a discrepancy that, once I heard it, made me want to understand exactly how the HOA's contracted pricing actually worked. I want to walk you through the research I did next, because it turned out to matter enormously. I requested, as an HOA member, the full contract between our association and the snow removal company, along with the complete billing history for all emergency snow removal charges issued that winter season. What that contract revealed, once I actually read through its fee structure carefully, was that the per-incident emergency removal rate the HOA had negotiated with the contractor was considerably lower, almost half, than what residents were actually being charged on their individual invoices, a discrepancy that meant someone, somewhere in the billing chain between the contractor and the individual homeowner invoices, was adding a substantial markup that didn't appear to be disclosed or explained anywhere in the association's own governing fee schedule. I want to introduce you to the attorney I contacted once this pattern became clear, a woman named Adiz Kowalski-Nwasu, who specialized in HOA financial governance disputes. Adiz reviewed the contract, the billing discrepancy, and Bartholomew's footage directly contradicting the factual basis of my own invoice, and told me within our first meeting that this represented something considerably more serious than a simple documentation error. "Odalise," she said, "you have two distinct problems layered on top of each other here. First, at least one invoice, yours, appears to be based on entirely fabricated or, at minimum, grossly inaccurate documentation of an alleged violation that your own neighbor's footage directly disproves. Second, and this may actually be the more significant issue, there's a substantial, undisclosed markup between what the HOA is actually paying the contractor per incident and what residents are being billed. A difference that, if it's not being properly accounted for and disclosed in the association's financial records, raises real questions about where that markup revenue is actually going." Adiz filed a formal records request seeking the complete financial trail for every emergency snow removal charge issued that winter, along with documentation of exactly how the markup between the contractor's actual rate and the resident-facing invoice amount had been calculated, and where those additional funds had been allocated within the HOA's own budget. What that request eventually revealed, after some initial resistance from the management office that Adiz had to formally push back against, was that the markup revenue had been flowing into a discretionary fund controlled directly by Priscilla, one she had established early in her tenure and described, in the limited board documentation that existed, as a community improvement contingency reserve, a fund that notably required no itemized reporting to the general membership regarding its actual expenditures. I want to walk you through the community meeting that followed, because once Adiz and I presented the full picture, the contract markup, the 5 other affected households, and Bartholomew's footage directly contradicting my own invoice's factual basis, the reaction moved considerably beyond simple frustration into genuine alarm about how much unaccounted revenue may have flowed through this discretionary fund over the preceding winter. I want to tell you about the specific moment that shifted the room's mood most decisively, because it happened when Adiz presented a simple side-by-side comparison, the contractor's actual per-incident rate against the resident invoice amount, multiplied across every documented emergency snow removal charge issued that season, arriving at a total markup figure of just over $4,000 collected from residents beyond what the HOA had actually paid its contractor. All of it flowing into a fund, with no itemized public accounting. Priscilla, given the opportunity to explain the discretionary fund's actual use, offered an account that satisfied almost nobody in the room, describing vague community improvement expenditures without any specific, verifiable documentation to support where the money had actually gone, an explanation that a man near the front, one of the affected households, responded to directly. "You charged us nearly double what the actual snow removal cost," he said, "and you can't tell us where the difference went. That's not a contingency fund. That's just money you took." I want to walk you through the vote that followed, because it authorized an immediate, full independent audit of the discretionary fund's entire history, not just the snow removal markup specifically, full refunds for every improperly billed snow removal invoice including mine, given Bartholomew's footage clearly establishing that no violation had actually occurred in my specific case, and Priscilla's immediate removal from the board pending the outcome of that broader audit. I want to tell you how the audit ultimately concluded, because it took several months given the scope of records involved. The independent auditor's findings confirmed that the discretionary fund had, over Priscilla's roughly 18 months in office, accumulated funds not just from the snow removal markup, but from several other similarly undisclosed fee markups across various contracted community services, landscaping, minor maintenance work, totaling just over $11,000 collected from residents beyond the association's actual contracted costs. with the fund's actual expenditure records showing a portion had gone toward genuine community improvements, but a meaningful remainder that the audit was unable to fully account for through any documented, verifiable community benefit. I want to tell you about the resolution, because Priscilla, facing both the audit findings and a formal demand from the HOA's own attorney for full restitution given the documented, undisclosed fund misuse, agreed to a settlement covering the full unaccounted amount, restored to the association's general operating budget, along with her permanent removal from any future board eligibility within the community. I want to tell you about my own $340 refund, because it arrived along with a formal written acknowledgement that no violation had actually occurred at my property that morning, a small but meaningful piece of accountability that I know mattered considerably to me, having spent several days genuinely doubting my own clear memory of a morning I knew, with total certainty, I had cleared that walkway myself. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Adiz said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing Bartholomew's footage alongside the invoice's confident, specific claims for what felt like the fifth time. She said that billing fraud within HOA structures often hides successfully behind exactly the kind of routine, unremarkable transaction my own dispute started as: a single invoice, easy to simply pay and forget, precisely because most residents don't have independent documentation contradicting the claim, and don't think to ask whether the fee they're being charged actually matches what the association itself is paying for the underlying service. We had that documentation, and it turns out that one neighbor's doorbell camera, angled just enough to catch my own walkway across the street, one contract fee schedule that revealed a markup nobody had bothered to explain, and one clear, time-stamped video showing exactly what did not happen that morning were more than enough to prove that Priscilla Wentworth-Ashcombe's confident snow removal invoice had never had anything real behind it, and to expose a pattern that had been quietly costing the entire community considerably more than anyone realized. Thumbnail text: And why neighbor's camera proved the fraud.